The tale of Dick Turpin, on England's infamously renowned highwayman. In the year 1705, England was a vastly different place than what we know today. Most roads were muddy and rutted, unlit by lanterns, and after sunset, they became one of the most perilous places in the country. Travelers moved on horseback or in heavy carts, which often got stuck in the mud. Between London, York, and other major cities, traders traveled daily with silver, gold, and precious goods. Landowners traveled with their families, and mail coaches carried important documents and money. Yet everyone knew that the journey could end at any moment. Just a solitary stretch of forest or a steep hill was enough for an armed highwayman to emerge from the darkness with a drawn pistol. It was in such times that a man was born, whose name became one of the most famous in all of English history, Richard Turpin, better known as Dick Turpin. Many consider him the English Robin Hood, a brave outlaw who robbed the rich and aided the poor. However, history tells a different story. Behind the romantic legend lurked a ruthless and violent criminal, whose real life was much darker than any novel. Richard Turpin was born in 1705 in Hempstead, Essex County. His father was a respected butcher, and the family lived modestly but without want. Young Richard helped his father in the shop during his childhood, learning to butcher meat and serve customers. Everything indicated that he would continue the family trade and lead a peaceful life. However, this was not enough for the young Turpin. He saw how hard people worked to earn a few coins, while others became rich overnight engaging in smuggling or theft. The temptation was too great. Initially, he joined a group of deer thieves. Hundreds of deer lived in the king's forests, and hunting them was strictly forbidden. One could earn a large sum by selling a hunted deer on the black market, so many took the risk. Soon Turpin got to know people who lived outside the law. They not only hunted but also stole livestock, broke into homes, and robbed wealthy farmers. This was the sadly infamous Essex Gang. At first, they seemed to seek only easy profits, but with each year, their crimes became increasingly ruthless. If a homeowner refused to reveal where the money was hidden, they would beat, threaten to kill, or even torture them. In several documents, it is described how the gang members burned people's legs on the fireplace coals until the victims surrendered. In some cases, they threatened to kill children to force parents to give up their last savings. These were not romantic outlaws from adventure books. They were brutal criminals, and Dick Turpin was one of them. News of the gang's crimes spread throughout England. Authorities announced a reward for their capture, and soon real manhunts began. Some of the gang were shot in skirmishes, others arrested and hanged. Turpin managed to escape, but he did not plan to start an honest life. On the contrary, he became even more dangerous. He chose to become a highwayman. It was one of the riskiest but also most lucrative forms of crime. Armed with pistols and a sword, he hid in the woods and waited for wealthy travelers. When the victim approached, Turpin suddenly emerged in the middle of the road, brandished his weapons, and demanded all valuables. Many yielded without a fight, knowing that resistance could cost them their lives. Turpin robbed not only landowners but also merchants, farmers, and even mail coaches. He was not interested in how rich or poor a person was. The main goal was to gain money and disappear before the soldiers arrived. It was during this time that stories about his famous horse, Black Bess, emerged. Legend has it that Bess was an unusually resilient and swift mare. One day, fleeing from pursuers, Turpin is said to have galloped over 300 kilometers in a single day from London to York. Such distance seems unbelievable even today. According to the story, the horse collapsed and died from exhaustion, but Turpin survived. This legend became so popular that it was repeated in books, theater plays, and later in films. However, historians believe that this event never actually happened. In fact, it originally belonged to another English highwayman, William Nevison. It was only much later that writers transferred this story to Dick Turpin, as his name had already become famous. As time passed, it became increasingly difficult to evade the law. Turpin began using an alias, John Palmers. He moved to Yorkshire and tried to live a quiet life, hoping that no one would recognize him. For a while, it seemed like the plan was working. However, fate can be ironic. One day, he got into a conflict with the local residents and shot someone's rooster. For this seemingly minor offense, he was arrested and placed in prison. No one suspected that one of England's most wanted criminals was behind the bars. Hoping for help, Turpin wrote a letter to his relative. It ended up with a schoolteacher who recognized his handwriting. The teacher immediately informed the authorities, and soon it became clear. John Palmer's was actually Richard Turpin. In March 1739, the trial began in York. The public expected him to be tried for robberies and murders, but the accusation was much simpler: horse theft. Today, it seems incredible, but back then a horse was a very valuable asset, and its theft was a crime for which the death penalty was often imposed. Turpin was found guilty and sentenced to hanging. On the morning of April 7, 1740, an unusual bustle prevailed in York. Thousands of people flocked to the gallows field. Public hangings were events that people eagerly anticipated. Traders sold pies, ale, and hot drinks, children ran among the adults, and people discussed the impending event as if it were a celebration. When Turpin ascended the scaffold, he surprised everyone. He was dressed in a costly coat, a clean shirt, and polished shoes. He did not look afraid. On the contrary, he calmly surveyed the crowd as if preparing for an important meeting. Some eyewitnesses later wrote that he even smiled and joked with the band. However, after a few moments, everything changed. The rope was coiled around his neck, and the support beneath his feet disappeared. Turpin underwent the so-called short drop hanging. This meant that his neck was not broken. Death came slowly, from suffocation. For several agonizing minutes, he struggled for every breath until it all ended. One might think that with this moment, Dick Turpin's story came to an end. However, in reality, it was just the beginning. Nearly 100 years later, the writer William Harrison Ainsworth published the novel Rookwood, in which Turpin was portrayed as a brave and noble hero. He was no longer a violent criminal but a daring outlaw who outwitted the rich and helped the poor. It was in this novel that the tale of Black Bess and the incredible journey across England gained great popularity. The book became a sensation. Readers were delighted, and soon Dick Turpin became one of the most popular folk heroes in England. His character appeared in dozens of books, theater plays, movies, and TV series. People fell in love with the legend and gradually forgot about the real man. In fact, there is no evidence that Turpin ever helped the poor or shared his loot with the needy. On the contrary, historical documents show that his victims were often simple people, and he never hesitated to use violence to achieve his goal. His life was full of blood, fear, and cruelty. However, history sometimes chooses to remember not the truth but the most beautiful stories. That is why more than 2 centuries after his death, Dick Turpin is still one of the most famous highwaymen in the world. Ironically, it was not his crimes that made him immortal, but the imagination of writers. Sometimes, one invented legend can outlive the truth by far, and the story of Dick Turpin is one of the most vivid examples in history.